We are thrilled to have you here for session 6 of the MPN Pathways series. So for any new participants, I want to say how happy we are to have you join the MPN Pathways program. My name is Sarah Douglas, and I'm the Director of Patient Engagement here at the MPN Research Foundation. I want each of you to feel really absolutely comfortable reaching out to us with any questions that you might have along the way. I can be reached directly at patientengagement@mpnrf.org. Here's a look at what we have coming up in the MPN Pathways Empowered Voices in Research program. Today's session features Dr. Jane Perlmutter and the Clinical Trial and Research Protocol 101. Our next session will be on March 19th, focused on informed consent, and this will be led by Dr. Emily Largent. In spring of 2026, we'll dive into really how patients and caregivers can interpret and evaluate scientific presentations. And then in summer of 2026, we'll focus on patient-reported outcomes and quality of life in MPNs. Speakers for those two sessions will be announced soon, and we'll let you know as soon as those registrations are available. And all of these sessions really build towards helping MPN patients and caregivers become confident, informed partners in research. And you can always find the most current schedule, registrations, evaluations, and just upcoming information on the speakers at mpnresearchfoundation.org/MPN Pathways. We want to take a moment to recognize and thank our MPN Pathways sponsors and collaborators for their support of this program. And for a few housekeeping items, for tonight's presentation, we encourage you to place any questions in the Q&A feature during the presentation. Our team behind the scenes will be answering questions as the speakers present. Please only utilize the chat feature to communicate with one another, but we do encourage you to introduce yourself and say where you're from, just to build that sort of community. But questions can be missed by our panelists if they're not put in the Q&A feature. So please do that if you have a question for our speaker. If there's time at the end to ask questions live, we will absolutely take advantage of that. But any questions that are not addressed, we will follow up via email with those answers. Also, as a reminder, we do apologize, but during this session, we're unable to answer really any personal medical questions related to your direct care or treatment. But we do encourage all participants to email patientengagement@mpnrf.org so we can help navigate you to the right resources and education to help you with questions you can ask your provider or to help you find an MPN specialist that is close to you. Tonight's presentation is being recorded. That link will also be provided to the MPN Pathways group after the webinar. The evaluation of the session will be sent to you in a post-event email. Please be sure to complete the evaluation for this session to earn credit towards your certification. And with that, we're going to go ahead and kick off Clinical Trial Protocol 101. I'm honored today to introduce Dr. Jane Perlmutter. Jane is a long-term cancer survivor and nationally respected research advocate with deep expertise in clinical trials, patient engagement, and research policy. She serves as a lead advocate for major trials like the I-SPY 2 and TAPER and contributes to committees across ASCO, NCI, and the National Academy of Medicine. She also trains emerging advocates and works closely with organizations like PCORI and CTTI. Jane's leadership has been widely recognized, including ASCO and the AACR Awards in 2023. But we are very fortunate to have her with us today. So welcome, Jane. I will go ahead and hand it over to you.
Thanks so much, Sarah, for both inviting me and for that introduction. And I am so happy to have so many participants here. Unfortunately, there are too many of you for us to be very interactive, which is really my preferred mode. But I did ask Sarah a little bit about who's on this webinar. And over 200 people have actually registered. Almost half of you are actually live. Others will see it recorded. And I learned that most of you are actually patients, many of you in clinical trials. And we also have a bunch of caregivers and a bunch of researchers with us. So that's a great group. And some of you have already been involved in working with clinical trials and helping make them better for patients. What we're going to do today is learn a little bit more about how that happens and how advocates can actually contribute in certain ways. Next slide. So these are the topics that I'm going to cover. First, really, one slide's going to tell us what a protocol is, and then we're going to be putting it a little bit in context with this other stakeholders and then advocate involvement. Actually talk about I'm calling it anatomy of the protocol. We'll actually go through a little bit of one, and then a little bit of review of clinical trials and how I try to think about them and how I actually then review a protocol when I do. Next slide. So a protocol is really a detailed plan about the trial, and it gives all the gory details, why the trial is being run, what the background is, what to do if there are some hiccups. And by hiccups, I mean things like if a patient is going through and having a side effect, what kind of change in the dose might happen, et cetera, et cetera. So their plan, it's really a plan for everyone involved, what to do. And by having everything written down in details like that, we make sure that the trial is actually ethical, that it will provide meaningful data, and that the results will actually be useful, which is why we even do it. And most importantly, that we protect the patients in the trial. We're doing trials to learn for future patients, but the patients in the current trial are most important, and we have to protect their safety. Next slide. So who are the stakeholders? And next slide. Um, So this slide shows you all the many people who are involved in the protocol, some of them actually while it's being developed and some of them while it's actually being implemented. And I'm just going to go around this circle and tell you a little bit about each of these groups, some of whom you'll know and some not so. I'll start at the top with sponsors. Sponsors are the people that decide to run the trials. Very often, they're the manufacturer of a drug. We're mostly going to be talking about trials that are run to identify new drugs to see whether a investigational drug is actually helpful for a certain patient population. There are other kinds of trials that actually compare, look at devices or compare different treatments that are already approved, but primarily, we're thinking about trials that pharma companies sponsor to actually get their drugs approved for the market. Any kind of trial does, though, have a protocol, and most of these players are involved. The principal investigator is typically a medical oncologist who has the primary responsibility for the fact that everything is working right in the trial. When there's a problem, people come to the principal investigator, often just referred to as the PI. And it's very often an academic investigator, but it might be someone that the pharma that works for the pharma company. The FDA, if it's a new investigational drug, actually has oversight as well and has to approve the way the trial is being run and looks at the protocol. And then when all the data are collected, they look at those data and see whether or not that can lead to an approval for marketing it. The Institutional Review Board, referred to as IRBs, are things that you might actually be engaged in. These are groups primarily of researchers, clinicians, and at least one community member, oftentimes an advocate, who actually review protocols as they're being ready to go to be implemented and make sure that the protocol, everything in it is ethical, meets ethical standards, and that's their primary role. Often other people are reviewing the scientific merit of the protocol, but the Institutional Review Board is primarily focusing on the ethics and thinking about the patients. And it's one of the reasons it's really important for advocates to participate in those reviews. As clinical trials are run, the data is usually not available to the people running the trial. The trial is often blinded. Who gets what drug? Neither the patient nor the doctors know. And the data itself, no one is looking at it except that there's a data monitoring committee, sometimes called data safety monitoring committee, DMC or DSMC. And they are made up of investigators, clinicians who might be treating some of these patients, and biostatisticians, and often a patient advocate. And these people look at the data as it's accumulating. They don't share it with anybody else, but they look for concerns that would make them want to recommend that the trial be changed. What I mean by that is if there's, let's say, a lot of safety issues, a lot of side effects associated with the investigational drug that were not anticipated, more than in the standard of care, they might say, wait, this is a problem. Maybe there needs to be a change. If the trial is not accruing adequately, they might say, wait a second, this is not going to ever complete in time. We need to relook at this. On the rare occasion that the data are coming in and they're so overwhelmingly positive, they might say, we should actually stop the trial early. It's unethical to keep people getting the standard of care. We should quickly go and get this approved. And again, on the very rare occasion that there's overwhelming evidence that there's not going to be any benefit, they would stop for futility. And as I mentioned, patient advocates are involved in this. The National Cancer Institute sponsors a lot of clinical trials, and they have the cooperative groups that run them. I actually am on the Data Safety Monitoring Committee for one of those groups. It's very interesting. We actually keep track of over 50 trials. The data that we get in our data monitoring committee, or that any data monitoring committee gets, are basically provided by data analysts at the very bottom of this chart. And these are typically biostatisticians who really know what they're doing and provide really nice summary data. Suppliers are involved. These are the people that provide the drugs. They might also provide some devices or some tests. For example, there might be a ctDNA test or etc. Moving along, clinical research organizations, or CROs as they're referred to, often are employed by the sponsor to run the trial. And, some trials are just single institution, particularly phase 1 trials. But larger trials that are actually being done close to getting approval are done at many, many sites, academic sites, community sites. Often they're global trials run internationally. And when it gets that complicated, you usually need an organization that specializes in running all kinds of trials. And clinical research organizations are those types. They employ all of these types of people, and they make sure that everything is working as it should, and have many staff to check things out, to monitor, to make sure the data are coming in as they should. The clinical trial coordinators are at each site. They're sometimes nurses or other allied healthcare providers, or other staff members who work directly with patients, making sure that they're if they're having any issues, and also making sure that all the data that are needed are collected and input into systems in a timely manner. And that's sometimes quite challenging. And finally, in the upper left, we have the treating clinicians. Each patient has their own clinician who is involved in the trial, but really their primary responsibility is to treat that patient as they would whether they're in the trial or not, and to look out for the best interest of that patient, following the trial protocol, but first and primary is that patient's interest. So that's a lot, but there's a lot involved in particularly phase 3 large global trials. Um, Next slide. One thing that was left out of that slide are advocates, and that's because I have a whole slide associated with that. It's also because historically advocates have not been very involved. But increasingly, both the sponsors, the investigators, and the advocates are recognizing that we're really all in this together, and the more we work together, the better trials are. And if you go to the next slide, you'll see actually, this is a video that talks about how advocates can help with trial protocols. In the interest of time, I'm not going to actually show this protocol, but it's about 6 minutes, and you'll be able to access this on your own afterwards. It's kind of a neat slide, which is why I put it in there. But there are many advantages to including advocates, and people are increasingly recognizing that actually, a lot of this started with the activists who said nothing should be done without my involvement. But now, increasingly, people are recognizing that if we have advocates involved, we're going to increase patient participation. We're going to have trials that are better designed. They're more patient friendly. We're going to take into account things that might have kept patients out of trials. And we're going to make sure that patients understand what's in them. If you do a informed consent review, which you're going to talk about in your March meeting, you can actually help make sure that the information is there, but that it's understandable. And for those of you who have been in clinical trials, you know that that's sometimes really challenging because keeping all the information that is needed there, but making it easy to understand is a real challenge. But people are constantly trying to improve that. And by having real patients look at them, that improves it. Having collaboration between researchers and advocates just always improves things. The researchers really get to understand the patient issues and address them more likely than just in the abstract. It also means that uh, more of the public really appreciates what goes into medical research and respects it. So it's really a win-win. And I've been involved in this for over 40 years. My first cancer was over 40 years ago, and I have two relatively recent ones that I'm being treated for. I'm so lucky to be alive, even though I've had such a cancer history. But I've been involved in research advocacy for all these years, and it's just so um, um, reinforcing to see the progress that we've made. We still have a ways to go, but it's really wonderful, and it's great that you guys are all getting involved at this point in time. Next slide. So here are some examples, and some of these are things that we've already talked about, actually, the various components. But as protocols are being developed, sometime advocates are being involved, or even before the idea for a trial comes up, sometime there are focus groups or other ways that people learn about what is important to patients. But once the protocol has actually been written, there's usually a protocol review committee that's looking at the integrity of the trial, whether it makes sense, whether it's going to be feasible, and advocates are often involved in that. Once the trial is actually planned and is actually running, there's a steering committee that continues to monitor it. And there's often advocates on that. And for example, the two trials that Sarah mentioned that I'm involved in, the I-SPY trial and the TAPER trial, I'm on their steering committee. We meet regularly. We talk about how things are going, whether there are some things that we should change in the trial, and make sure that everybody is actually doing what they need to do. And sometimes there are some, as I said, hiccups for individual patients, or perhaps maybe the data is not coming in a timely manner, or something else has happened in the environment. A new drug has been approved, and we need to think about changing something. But just making sure that things go right. And, some trials are relatively short-lived if it's a short course of treatment, but some trials that are looking for overall survival in a disease that has a long lifespan could go on for quite a while. So this can be, a long process. We've already talked about the institutional review boards. The protocol review boards look at the whole protocol. The institutional review boards are primarily looking at the trial from the ethical point of view. We also talked about the data monitoring committee. Again, patient advocates are increasingly being involved in those. Some trials have peer support for participants. So, for example, in the I-SPY trial that I'm involved in, we have a number of our advocates, some of whom have actually completed being in the trial, and others who, like myself, who are not in that trial but are very much engaged, are available to patients who are currently thinking about being in the trial or are already in the trial. And it's just one more way to support participants. Sometimes there are some things they may not feel comfortable talking to their healthcare providers, or it might be that they're looking for some support for just someone who's already been there. I think we all know that it's really very, very helpful to talk to people who have had similar experiences. It's one of the reasons I think some of you like to be on these calls, and why Sarah encouraged you to get to work in the chat and talk to each other. And when patients are in trials, it's especially trying situation, and having some peer support can be helpful. There's often both formal and informal interaction between researchers and advocates, and this is really wonderful and has really increased, where people realize that we're all in the same thing together. We're really trying to help patients, and we can learn from each other and respect each other. I especially really like to work with very new investigators, because they're the people that are most impressionable. And we do this, in the context of the trial, but other times as well, sometime at professional meetings. So we look at their posters or read their articles. And one other item that I didn't put on this slide, and I probably should have, is that advocates are increasingly involved in disseminating the results of trials. Sometimes they're co-authors on professional journal articles, or on presentations at professional meetings. And even more often, we're trying to make sure that plain language summaries of results are provided, that they're readily available in some website, as well as being provided directly to the patients who are in the trial. And some of you might be asked to help writing those or reviewing them. So lots of different opportunities for involvement, and increasing opportunities. And, Sarah said that one of the goals of this program is to make sure that everyone is competent in playing these roles. I do a lot of this kind of training, and I know that we need to do some training to make people competent, to know a little bit about the science. But most of all, people need to feel confident. A lot of patients, you know, ha have the experience, but don't feel confident to express it. And you need to listen to other people who have done that and sort of learn how to do it. And there are forms to help you with it. And just practice to articulate to each other some feedback that you have. Try out, if you're doing a review of something, work with other advocates to make sure that you have the full perspective. And don't worry too much about the science. Worry about conveying the patient issues, the patient experience. And we'll see this in some of the specific examples of the protocol. But at the next slide, I just think I have some specific types of questions that you should ask. And this is where I'm saying focusing on the patient. And some of these are the questions that you could ask. Does the trial really address something important to patients? Some trials, look at things that are not the most important thing to patients. Long life is definitely important, but also the quality of life is important. And we need to remind investigators of that. Are the results likely to be important when the study is completed? If the trial is going to take forever, it may not be relevant. And that's something to raise, or at least ask the question. One of the other things I often say to advocates is, the most effective way to get a point across is to ask a question. Even if you think you have an answer, asking a question will engage everyone else. And it also puts less pressure on you, but oftentimes it's just really asking the question. It's the trial ethical, and it does prioritize patient safety. And if there's any inclination that it doesn't, you should ask the question, will patients understand the informed consent form? And there are specific steps when you would actually review that. Many protocols actually include the informed consent, and that's part of protocol review, but oftentimes that's a whole separate review. Are there ways that you can make the trial more patient-friendly? People probably don't think about, the scheduling of various activities, but you do. You're a patient. You know you don't wanna have to come into the clinic 3 days in a row or even every week if it can be, combined, and you need to think about the, patient's convenience. There may be other issues like transportation. Are they providing compensation for travel? So those are things that as advocates you should raise. Are the benefits likely to outweigh the risks? And many trials have extra procedures or tests or other things that are actually burdensome to patients. But patients like to be in trials. On the one hand, because it's altruism and they know it will help future patients, but they also usually cancer patients like to be in trials because they're hoping for a better outcome. And there are no guarantees for sure, but the risks should not be so much that they would outweigh the benefits. Will the trial recruit representative patients? And this is something that we've become more and more sensitive to. When drugs are approved, they're approved for a lot of patients, but sometimes people with comorbidities are not included in trials, and there may be a reason if it might put a patient at risk, we don't want to include them. But if it's just because that's what they've always done, we should not have that as an exclusion criteria. We want to make sure that patients from all different geographic and ethnic areas are included, and advocates can raise that question. Are we sure that we're going to recruit a representative sample of patients? And finally, are patients likely to not only enroll, but comply with the requirements of the trial and remain in the trial? One of the most disappointing things is when we actually accrue patients, when patients sign up and then they drop out. That's really bad for the patient and bad for the trial and a waste. And we should design the trial to make sure that doesn't happen and ensure that there's adequate support for the patients throughout the trial. So those are at least some of the questions. Let's move on to the next slide. And I think we're going to get to anatomy of a protocol. A funny name, I guess, but that just popped into my head when I was working on this. So the next slide shows you the cover sheet of a protocol. And basically, it provides some basic information, the trial name, the sponsor, all the details about that. And often the principal investigator is also listed, and maybe some of the other key personnel, but on this one, it's not. And this is actually a trial protocol that Sarah provided for me, that it's one that you guys might have been involved in. The next slide shows you the table of contents. And you can see here that this is a little bit overwhelming. This protocol has 4 pages just for the table of contents, and there's about 300 pages in the protocol. It's not unusual. I've seen protocols that are 600 pages. So don't think that if you're agreeing to be in protocol review that you need to go through all of this. Next slide. Um, Here's just the top level. Those 4 pages had all those subcomponents, but just wanted to show you the basic overall what's included. There's a very nice protocol summary that if you're reviewing, you should look at fairly carefully. Here, it's about 10 pages, so it captures what's everything, all the other sections, but not in gory details. The introduction, actually, we'll go through some of these sections, but that has the background and why and the scientific justification. And then there's a lot to do with the actual running of the trial. And down towards the bottom, you can see the plan for analyzing it. And then there's a bunch of supporting documentation. So let's go to the next slide. And we can see we're going sort of and seeing where you should look, skimming it and then reading carefully. The summary, I do think you should look at fairly carefully, and we'll go through a few parts of that. And the introduction, here you should skim it. Don't get bogged down in the science. Read it from the perspective of the patient. Next slide. So the trial schema, you should keep maybe a copy of that in front of you or in your mind's eye. This is basically what the trial is all about. And this one is a relatively simple trial. Patients get screened if they're eligible and want to be in the trial. They get randomized 1-to-1 to be in an experimental arm or a control arm. Very, very common. An experimental arm typically includes a standard of care drug plus some additional drug that may be beneficial. And the control arm is just the standard of care, and sometimes a placebo, so that people don't know whether or not they're in the control or standard of care. So it might be a pill or something like that. And then there's follow-up, and there's details about what that follow-up might look like. Next slide. The other part that's in the introduction, in the overview, is a schedule of activities. And here again, we have 4 pages. Well, we can't read, I assume, unless you have a huge screen, you can't read that. But next slide will give you a slightly better view. And you can see here what's included in each of them. And across each of the columns sort of talk about different timing of the trial. So the left-hand column just tells you the procedures that are included, and then where the second column, where in the protocol you can find the details. And then there's one column for the screening period, and then the C is cycle. So cycle 1, cycle 2 through 8, cycle 9 and 10, and the end of the trial, and moving all the way to the right, what kind of follow-up is there? And here we can see the X's just show what's happening during screening, where there's the informed consent and medical history and things like that. But if we went through the other 3 pages of the schedule, we would see what happens in the other during actually the implementation of the trial in cycles 1 through 10, as well as the follow-up. And you should skim that and particularly focus on things that might be relevant to the patient. Next slide. So here's the point areas that might be more important for you to look at a little more carefully. In the objectives and endpoints and study design, you really want to make sure that this is something that is important to the patients. And the scientific rationale probably you can not look at very carefully, but justification for dose would be something that you might want to look at. And the study participation issues should also be looked at. And the study population, as we talked about, we really want to make sure that we don't have exclusion criteria that would limit the generalizability of the trial, they're only really excluding patients who would possibly be hurt by the trial. So these are the sections in the trial. The next slide, I think, goes into a little bit more. This is also something that you should review, and in particular, you should make sure that this would not be overly burdensome for the patient. These are fairly typical things that are looked at, but one that you might want to pay a special attention to is patient-reported outcomes, 8.2.2. Increasingly, and to all of advocates' happiness, we're including patient-reported outcomes. It used to be that doctors would be telling us whether or not patients had side effects, and they often did not adequately reflect how the patients are feeling and functioning. But increasingly, we ask patients directly to tell us, and there are some standard questionnaires that are used. Some of you may have participated in them. And we want to make sure that the questions that are being asked are really relevant, that they're clear, and that they're not overburdensome. Some trials sometimes put in so much and ask patients to keep, to answer every single day, and that might be really too burdensome. So you should think about how much time this is going to take and whether or not there's really meaningful questions there. And that is something worthwhile that probably you are in the best position to take a look at. Next slide. I'm going to, in the last few minutes that we have, give you a sort of a framework that I often use in reviewing protocols and in thinking about clinical trials in general. Next slide. So PCOT is a mnemonic device to help rapidly think about a trial and organize it. And the P stands for population. Who are we looking at? The I, the intervention, and typically the experimental drug. The C, comparison, typically the standard of care. The outcome, what are we measuring? Are we measuring time on treatment? Are we measuring time till progression? Are we measuring overall survival? And usually we pick one of those as a primary outcome, and then others that we might look at in addition, but that we are not as important. And time frame is, how long is the trial going to run, and what kind of follow-up is there. So next slide will sort of show you this. I often put together a table like this, and I have the 5 components. And here, what I've shown you is which parts of the protocol you'll find the information. And what you can do is sort of skim the protocol and try to fill in, just a little bit of summary information to help you remember and think about the trial. And the next slide actually goes over each of these sections and gives you some examples of the types of questions that you could ask about each one. So these are a bit redundant with the questions we asked before, but that it fits into this framework in a way that is really, I find, quite helpful. So the population, really, are the eligibility requirements reasonable? Have they excluded anyone? And will we end up with a representative sample? Likewise, in the intervention, are the risks really commensurate with the potential benefits? And are there possible ways for us to minimize the risks and side effects, or even to maximize the benefits? I always like to ask. And I have a whole other presentation on possible ways to do that. The control or comparison, is this the appropriate comparison? And sometime it's not. Sometime, I think this is a little cynical, but pharma companies who want to get their drug approved might have a standard of care that's maybe not the really best current standard, and that might make their drug look better. And we have to look out for that. Will patients be willing to be randomized to these two uh, arms of the trial? That's often a problem. And crossover, if a patient has a negative outcome, perhaps progression, can they move into the other arm? If the experimental arm, if they're in the standard of care and then they have progression, can they move into the other arm? And then the outcomes, there's primary outcomes, secondary outcomes, and exploratory outcomes. Are these things that are important? And will the data be too onerous for participants? And finally, the procedures in timing, are the procedures scheduled convenient to patients? Is there some flexibility? Will the results likely to be meaningful when they are available? So there's lots of questions like this. And the final slide that I want to present is just a slight advertisement, not really, but quite a few years ago, I wrote this tutorial of Understanding Clinical Trial Design, a tutorial for research advocates. It gets into a little bit more of the statistics, and it also has even more questions that you could ask about each of these components. And if you're interested, it's available on the web. Don't feel obligated. And I am always happy to speak to advocates. And my email was on the first slide, I believe. Don't hesitate, or Sarah can help you get in touch with me. I love to hear how people are doing and help them out. And hopefully we'll run into some of you at some meeting or something and just come up and introduce yourself. I go to ASCO almost every year and sometime to AACR. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Sarah, who's going to talk about what I think is some really exciting new things that the MPN are actually doing and how you guys will get involved. And then I'll be happy to take questions. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Jane. That was incredibly comprehensive and so very valuable. So I appreciate all your expertise and you sharing that with us tonight. It's wonderful. Um, so what I want to do is, patients and caregivers are really already meaningfully involved in clinical trial protocol review through the MPN Research Foundation. Our reviewers, many of whom are patients themselves, really are helping us start to ensure that protocols are understandable, realistic, and really aligned with real-world lived experience. So once MPN Pathways participants are certified, we absolutely plan to invite those who are interested to join this work. You'll be able to review protocols and provide feedback really directly to the research teams and some of our industry partners. To show you what this looks like, I'm going to walk you through our online protocol review form. We've tried to make it as simple as possible for you to be able to input those feedback that Jane talked about. So the first page really captures basic reviewer information. So your name, your email, what your MPN diagnosis is. Reviewers also enter the protocol title and the principal investigator name. Sometimes the form that we do provide you already has that, so that's something that you won't have to complete, but we want to make sure that that feedback is linked back correctly to the right research protocol. But this page also lists all the sections that the reviewers will look at. So protocol description and background, study endpoints, eligibility requirements and assessments, patient-facing materials, participant incentives, and overall feedback. So this form, we also have made it so you can save it and you can resume and then go back and do it. It takes a long time. You might think of something later. So before you submit it, there's always that opportunity to save it and then go back when you have some free time or when you're in a spot to really provide that feedback. So page 2 focuses on the design of the study and asks reviewers to evaluate whether the structure of the trial is appropriate and understandable from a patient perspective. So this page includes several important questions. So is the study design appropriate? This helps us understand whether the trial layout makes sense and it feels logical to patients. What changes could minimize patient burden, so reviewers can call out unnecessary procedures, long visits, or anything that feels overly demanding. Does the trial include randomization or different groups? So if so, reviewers tell us whether the explanation of those groups is clear, if it's understandable. Are the objectives clear? So this ensures that the primary and the secondary goals of the study are stated in a way that patients can really understand and follow. And are the risk and benefits adequately explained? So we want to make sure that nothing feels hidden, unclear, or overly technical. And are there practical considerations around administration? So things like visit link, drug formulation, or anything that might be challenging for participants in the study. But overall, page 2 ensures that the protocol is not only scientifically sound, but also realistic, ethical, and understandable for someone who's considering joining this study. Page 3 really looks at what the study is actually trying to measure. So we ask reviewers whether the endpoints feel meaningful and relevant. Do they reflect changes that matter to patients in their daily lives? Patient feedback here often leads to stronger, more patient-centered outcomes. And then page 4 is our eligibility criteria. So this page asks reviewers to assess the inclusion and exclusion criteria. Patients help highlight whether these criteria are too restrictive, unclear, or likely to create barriers for many people. This input really helps researchers balance scientific rigor with real-world access. And then page 5 is one of the most important sections of the entire review. So this page asks reviewers to evaluate the real-world experience of being in the study. These expectations that are there, the time commitment, the practical burden to participants. Patients are often asked to consider, are the expectations clear and fair? This includes total length of the study and what participants must commit to. Is the schedule of events feasible? That, Jane showed us that kind of large timeline of the cycles and what's going on. So this includes screening visits, baseline assessments, and all those follow-up visits. Are those feasible with everyday life? Is this visit schedule manageable? Reviewers weigh in on how often participants have to come in, how long the visits are, and what they must complete at home. Schedule events also, thinking about some of those bone marrow biopsies. Are they asking them to be completed too frequently? Those are the things that we want to know in this review. And how will participants feel about dose escalations or schedule changes? So many protocols use dose escalation strategies, and patients can provide insight on whether those changes are confusing, if they're stressful, or if they're hard to manage. If there's, again, any procedures or assessments that are likely to be challenging, any questionnaires that are being used too often or not often enough. So patients provide perspective on the balance between data collection and burden. This section really gives researchers extreme valuable insight into how the study will actually feel and function for somebody living with an MPN. It also helps ensure that the study, again, is not only scientific rigorous, but also realistic and respectable of patients' time, energy, and well-being. And then patient-facing materials and recruitment. So what type of information would patients like to receive as a part of the clinical trial and from whom? So thinking about your peers, your doctor, patient organizations like the MPN Research Foundation, or from a family member, and to elaborate a little bit on that. And then we also ask for any recruitment strategies. You are those who are living in the community. You're really our champions. What are some of those recruitment strategies that will help researchers and industry partners really recruit for some of those trials? And then this page addresses compensation and support for participants. So things like travel reimbursement or payment for their time. Patients also help determine what the what incentives are appropriate. So offsetting those real costs reflect the time, effort, and inconvenience of participation. And this input really helps ensure fairness and accessibility. And then our final page here allows reviewers to share any additional thoughts or major concerns. So this is where reviewers can commit on clarity or comment on clarity, feasibility, ethical considerations, or anything else that may not fit neatly into the earlier sections that we provided. It's also where we gather recommendations for improving participant experience. Though the structured protocol review process or through it, patients and caregivers have already helped really improve multiple clinical trials. We have many of our patient impact council members and our patient engagement advisory committee for the registry really working on these protocol reviews already, and we're so excited to have some of you complete this certification, and we are really looking forward to welcoming those who are interested in contributing to this important work. We know that your lived experiences bring an essential perspective that truly shapes the future of MPN research. A lot of patients here, and you talked about patient feedback, but we also have a lot of caregivers. And so can you share a little bit about how maybe some of their experiences can also contribute it? They're the individuals that are behind the scenes checking on appointments, following up on labs. And so in your experience, have you worked with caregivers on protocol review?
Caregivers are definitely welcome in almost any of these settings that I talked about patient advocates. And in fact, the word patient advocate, I think, would include caregivers because caregivers are advocates for the patients. So I would say that probably not a single one of these that caregivers could not be involved in. And I would encourage people who are interested. Sometime a patient does not have the energy to want to do it, but a caregiver might be able to. Or it could even be a shared experience where you're working together. I really want to encourage it. There's many, many more patient advocates who are or have been patients, but there are quite a few really wonderful people who have been caregivers who really contribute enormously, and we really appreciate them. We welcome them, and I'm glad there are some of them on this call. Probably some that didn't even register, but are just sitting next to the person that they're helping. Um, but yeah,
Excellent.
just because I'm not sure that there are a lot of questions, just let me say that from my perspective, the form that Sarah came up with is really terrific. I know I've been over the years involved in coming up with different forms and ways to summarize, but it looks like quite a bit. There's quite a few pages, but there's really not all that much there, and I think it would be, when you go through them, I don't think I better ask Sarah, but I don't think you have to answer every single one. But whatever you provide would be helpful. And, working with some other folks, if a few people are doing this, you'll get lots of good stuff. And then sharing what you have to say can be very reinforcing. And when you see that people pick up on it and then come back and ask for more reviews, it's just really wonderful.
Excellent. Thank you for that, Jane. Another thing I wanted to ask you is we have patients and caregivers complete these reviews, but we also host live sessions so they can really speak to the researchers directly. What value do you think that brings to really not only hear those insights in person or virtually, and have that hand in hand with the feedback provided in some of those forms and some of those direct reviews?
Right. I've been in a number of those sessions, and I think there are at least two real benefits. One is sometimes researchers really never see real patients, and
Mhm.
it's very impactful when they do. And in fact, if you have the opportunity to even go to a research lab, sometimes there are people that are working in the lab that don't see real patients, and they so much appreciate seeing and talking to real patients. And likewise, patients really learn a little bit about what the science is really like. And the other benefit is having patients talk. Usually, these are done, I assume, Sarah, the ones that I've been in, are a small group of maybe a half a dozen patients talking to several people from the sponsor organization. And those patients can feed off of each other. They end up having a community, and they can reinforce each other. In addition, when I first started doing advocacy, I was often the only person in the room, but I always encouraged people to have at least two people, in part to see that, not all patients are exactly the same. People often ask me, what do patients think? And the first thing I say is, well, you talk to one patient, you talk to one patient. Each patient is unique, and there's the gamut. On the other hand, as a good patient advocate, you've probably talked to or heard from enough other patients to sort of hear the range of views. And by having a meeting, you can hear the range. And then if you're future reviewing, even if you're a solo person, you can say, even if I wouldn't feel this way, I think there are other patients that might. And I think that's an added benefit of having those kinds of focus groups.
Absolutely, those are spot on. And I think also it gives newer reviewers the opportunity to also just have some of that mentoring. Because it is scary as you first going into it. Sometimes it's just nice to sit in there and hear how others contribute, or some of those ideas. So I think that's great.
Exactly, especially the newer advocates. When I started out, I would listen to other advocates and I would learn the things that I wanted to emulate and the things that I wanted to avoid emulating. And, each of you will do that when you hear how other people talk, and you want to have your own sincere voice, but you don't want to talk about your own experience too much. You want to think about the entire patient population.
That's an incredibly, yeah, good point. Okay, it looks like the team has answered most of the questions behind the scenes. So I've got a few more slides to share here on kind of upcoming events. But Jane, we can't thank you enough. Also, anybody that has any questions, if you think of them after we leave here, please email me at patient engagement. I will make sure that Jane gets those. But Jane, thank you so much. You bring such wonderful knowledge, and we are so we're so grateful that you shared that with all of us
Well,
today.
it's really my pleasure. I love to do these things, and I really did not know about this organization until I got the email from you, but it seems like wonderful work you're doing, and thank you for doing it. And in advance, thank all of the advocates who are getting involved. It's great to have this community. You get more out of it than you give, but you also give a lot. At
Yeah.
least I get a lot more out of it than I give. I'm going to sign off, and thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Jane. That's wonderful. Okay, couple more closing slides. So again, you may have been seeing some emails, but we are really thrilled to share that the MPN Progression Registry is now open for enrollment. So if you are an adult living in the US with the MPN, you can now have a direct role in advancing MPN research. So we've made participation easy, secure, and it takes a few minutes to enroll, but it makes a lasting impact to help researchers better understand how MPNs change over time. And we do have a whole team now that, if you have any questions as you're enrolling, please email us at research@mpnrf.org, or you can email me at patient engagement, but we'll make sure we get you the help so you can join the registry. You can join directly at mpnresearchfoundation.org/mpn progression registry, or we do have the QR code on the screen. But then Emily who is our patient engagement coordinator for the registry, has also linked that into the chat. So it's also available there. If you have any questions, please let us know. And then I also want to share details about our next MPN pathway session. So on March 19th, we'll be joined by Dr. Emily Largent, an expert in research ethics and informed consent. So she brings a unique background as an attorney, a PhD, researcher, and nurse, and she'll walk through what informed consent should really look like from a patient's perspective. And this session is really especially relevant for anyone interested in protocol review or participating in research. You can register using the link on the slide that was sent before. I think Emily's also linked it in the chat, and we'll send those post-event emails as well. And then lastly here, I also want to share that we have an upcoming Giving Tuesday webinar on December 2nd. We'll be joined by Dr. Shannon Elf, who's going to discuss her treatment's progress using CRISPR-based approaches to better understand and potentially target MPN driver mutations. So it's a great opportunity to hear directly from a leading researcher about where this work is headed. You can register using the link on the slide. I think Kylie or Emily have linked it there, so that's great. And then this session will be recorded if you're unable to join live. But with that, we're going to conclude for this evening. Again, the evaluation of this session is going to be sent to you in the post-event email along with any recording and the Q&A. So please make sure that you complete the evaluation for this session to earn credit towards that certification. But again, thank you all for being here. Thank you for continuing us on the MPN Pathways journey. We are thrilled to have you, and reach out with any questions or comments. Thank you so much. Have a good rest of your evening.